You have to turn it on. This is why I haven't been doing this all weekend, and they've been letting more professional people like Jock Sarong do this. First of all, I would like to acknowledge that we gather today on the lands of the Gunditj Marp and Pik Wurrung people, and that these lands were never ceded, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. This is the last session. This is the end. Oh my God, I can't believe it's over. Thank you to everyone for coming to the Port Fairy Literary Weekend. It has been a fantastic weekend, and we arrive here at the ultimate panel. We have here Rob McDonald, who you might know. He was here a couple of years ago talking about the Nancys. Great books, check those out. But today we're here to he will tell you, ask questions of, and you'll learn all about Jonathan Butler, who is here, and the book The Boy in the Dress. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for coming along. So today's session is also part of QWS podcast, which is short for Queer Rights Sessions, which was a project that Joe at Blarney Books and I started last year, and we've just been doing the podcast this year. So it's in partnership with Blarney Books and Art in Port Fairy. So very, very excited to be able to do this event here. Thank you so much, Joe. And to do it with Jonathan Butler, whose book, The Boy in the Dress, was such a fantastic read, and certainly we'll be talking about just the mixture of genres and how it came to be. So I just want to firstly introduce Jonathan Butler. Jonathan Butler is a writer and content producer living in Melbourne, Australia. Jonathan's debut book, The Boy in the Dress, was published by Firm Press in February 2022 and was shortlisted by the Age Book of the Year 2022 non-fiction. He has said researching his ancestors' story has ignited his passion for queer history. Jonathan's work has appeared in The Guardian, Arts Hub and Mianjin. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thanks for having me, Rob.
So, as part of QWS podcast, we have an opening question, which we ask all our guests, which is, how has your work influenced your identity?
I'm very glad that you pre-warned me for this question, because it is a big one. And I have two answers, I think. My first answer would be sort of while writing the book and since it's come out. Both have had a very profound impact on my identity. I guess in a way this book is about how my family's story and my research has shaped my identity as a queer man. It was very, so, the book is about Warwick Sydney Mill. He was my grandmother's cousin, and there was a family rumour that he was gay and that his murder was because of his sexuality. So, he always had a really big part of my life growing up. So researching not just what happened to him, but the treatment of queer people throughout history had a really profound impact on me, and learning, it was really interesting to sort of find people from history who I actually shared a lot with. When you're younger, you kind of assume that, you're alone and that there's no one else in the world who's like you. So that was really affirming. And I also learned a lot about, what horrors had happened in the past, and all the horrible things that still happen and that we need to improve. So that really gave me a strong sense of who I am as a gay man, I suppose. The second part of that answer is since it's come out, and I think a lot of writers in the room can probably understand the hesitation to call yourself a writer. For a very long time, I was like, oh, I'm right. I wouldn't even tell people I was writing it. I was just too ashamed. And then I finally did, and I'm so glad that I did, because people had wonderful ideas and wanted to hear about the project. And then now that it's finally out, it's nice to be able to call myself a writer. That's a big part of my identity now. And yeah, as you mentioned, since it got shortlisted from the Age Book of the Year as well, that's been a really nice nod. And even less concerned with calling myself a writer. So that's, part of my identity as well.
Congratulations again on your shortlisting, which is fantastic. And
Thanks.
Absolutely hear you with the calling yourself a writer.
Yeah, it's tough.
It's its own coming out process that we go through.
It's very true.
So I just wanted to read for everyone The Boy in the Dress, the blurb, so everyone knows what we're talking about. On a balmy Townsville night in 1944, a young serviceman, Warwick Meal, is found murdered. The Army and police do not or will not conduct a proper investigation, and history forgets the killer, until now. Nearly 80 years on, Warwick's descendant, Jonathan Butler, dusts off the case and chases the leads that were there all along. The Boy in the Dress exhumes secrets of life on the home front during World War II, where tensions between soldiers boiled over, new expressions of sexuality flourished, and the threat of invasion catapulted the status quo into disarray. The truth of this family legend and this little-known chapter in Australian military history is more complex and engrossing than anyone could have imagined. So, congratulations again, Jonathan, on The Boy in the Dress. For those who haven't read it, it's very compelling, and it's such an interesting mashup of family history, memoir, Australian military history, queer history. So can you tell us how the book came about? How did you end up with the story we have now?
Sure. So it really started right back when I was basically as long as I can remember, like 5 years old. There was a photograph that hung on my mother's bedroom wall, and that was of a little boy and a little girl playing dress-ups, and it's on the inside cover. So I'll just hold that up for everyone in the audience, for those on the podcast. The little boy is wearing a dress, has a doll, has a parasol and a hat, and the little girl is wearing a suit. It's a classic sort of game of mothers and fathers or something. And the reason I was so drawn to it is I've always known that I was gay, but I was very ashamed of it from a young age. Certainly couldn't talk about it with my family, didn't see it anywhere on TV, didn't talk about it at school, didn't know anything. So, you know, even though it was just one photograph, it had a profound impact on me. I have 3 older sisters. There was lots of dresses and dolls and Barbies lying around, and I really loved playing with them. So, you know, looking at this photo of Warwick, I was like, oh, maybe there's other boys who like to do this. Maybe I'm not alone. Maybe it isn't. I don't need to be as ashamed of it as I was. So yeah, I've always had this sort of perceived relationship, I guess, with Warwick. When I got older, I was around 16 or 17. My mum was a hardcore family history enthusiast. So just when Ancestry.com came online, I see a few nods in the audience. She was a big fan of that, and basically because there was so many family secrets, you know, she had heard all these rumours, and she was really excited about the prospect of finding some facts behind these family rumours. And I share a lot with my mum, and I also was drawn into that, and both of us, you know, really got into it. And one of those family secrets was what happened to Warwick. So yeah, Warwick, when he was just 20 years old, was murdered in Townsville in 1944. The killer was never found. The motive was never identified. And Mum believed that Warwick was gay and that his murder was a result of a gay hate crime. The reason she came to that conclusion, a few reasons. One, there was a family rumour that he was gay, and that's her. So my mother's mother was, you know, very didn't like talking about it, so it was very hard to get any facts about what actually happened. So Mum was very excited about the prospect of finding some answers on Ancestry, and I also got really involved. So yeah, from a very young age, researching it, and for a really long time it was just a research project. In 2014, the Serial podcast came out, which is a true crime podcast, and I'd been to uni by that point, and I was like, oh, I remember there's a true crime story in my family. We didn't really get to the bottom of it. And yeah, because I'd been to uni, I'd learned a few research skills, and that's when I dived headfirst into researching, and I researched it for a really long time. And what I discovered was so fascinating, I just decided I had to tell it. How I was going to tell it, I wasn't sure. I was like, maybe I could do a podcast, who knows? But ultimately, I decided to write a book. And so, yeah, I was very much a researcher before a writer.
Fantastic. And so with Warwick, so Warwick is your
Grandmother's cousin.
grandmother's cousin.
Yep.
Right. Yep. And your mum did your mum, because in the book you also weave in your own personal history.
Yeah.
And you share about, and your mum is such a, it's you and your mum investigating, and you really tap into that, and which is fantastic. It's almost like, you've got these amateur detectives who are, you write it so well. It's actually, you've got great narrative drive, but we're learning all these things as we go. So, was your mum as determined as you to get to the bottom of it, or even more so?
Absolutely not. No, she wasn't. As I said, there was a few strange tales in my family, and I think, she just loved family history, and she definitely wanted to learn about all of them. But I think the fact that I had this sort of connection with Warwick, obviously that personal connection of, the belief that he was gay and that his murder was a result of that had, huge impact on me. So, getting to the bottom of not only what happened to him, but whether he was gay and, it happened in the 40s, and, I had absolutely no idea if there were any gay people at World War II. At school, I certainly didn't learn that. And so I wanted to find out, were there gay people during World War II? And if so, what was their life like? So I had just endless questions that I wanted to answer, and that really drove me. Mum was certainly fascinated with what I found. But I definitely took over the reins later in the project.
And how were your family and extended family about you going in on this journey? Did you have any opposition, or were they supportive, or they just wanted to see what you came up with?
Mixed. A lot of people were very supportive. I did sort of do it by myself for a long time. I did ask a few people. It's really challenging researching a story that is so old that there wasn't a lot of people who were still alive who could talk to me about it. But I did face a bit of opposition. I think it is hard. With that older generation, secrets are pretty common, and especially for topics that are sensitive and hurtful. And, my grandmother was incredibly sad about it. So there was a lot of silence and apprehension about me sort of admitting that we had a murder victim in the family, that perhaps there was shame involved with that. But I am of the belief that it's the opposite, of disrespectful. It's the utmost respect I could show to my ancestor in trying to find out what happened to him and tell his story respectfully. So I guess, if nothing else, it encouraged really interesting conversations and created a space for me to have some really rewarding conversations with my family.
Yeah, I remember at your launch, and you were speaking about how through this process, it really opened up communication within your family about, talking openly and honestly about all kinds of things, yeah? Yeah,
definitely. So a big part of my book is memoir. So initially I had just written, mainly it was, the first sort of drafts were definitely just the crime. I just wanted to find out about the crime. I was so fascinated with the detective's investigation and what happened that I just wanted to tell that. And I just added one chapter around a story about my sisters catching me in a dress, and the shame with that and how it went down, and just to explain why Warwick was so important to me. And I gave it to some writer friends who had a read, and they ultimately said, "Oh, we love that. We want more of that memoir." So I went through an exercise of just sitting down and writing my experience of growing up queer in regional Australia. I grew up in Launceston, Tasmania. So I basically wrote that, and a big part of my growing up queer experience was defined by my family, and those experiences, like being caught in a dress, and they weren't particularly supportive initially. So that did make it into the book. And yeah, before it came out, I had to talk to them and work out, as anyone who's written memoir knows, it can be tricky to manage the family. But basically my strategy was to send them an email with a dot list of everything that's going to be in it. And then we had a Zoom call. It was during the days of lockdown. And I was very nervous, and sure enough, the first half of the call was very worrying because everyone was like, oh no, I'm going to get cancelled, or, and then halfway through, my sister said, you know what, I think we're actually just a bit sad and ashamed of the way we behaved and the way that we treated you back then. And that very moment, just something clicked with everyone, and everyone realised that that's where that apprehension was coming from. And then from that moment, it just became a really lovely conversation. I talk about my coming out story, which didn't go down too well, especially with my parents. But my dad said at the end of that call, I don't include everything in the book. I'm not proud of how I behaved, but I'm so proud of you, of what you've done, and I just hope that other people out there can read about it and learn from it and, get something from it. So, yeah, hearing that from my dad, I just was not expecting that. And all these conversations came about because I wrote this book. So, yeah, I'm very grateful for this whole process.
Yeah, absolute. Kudos to you and for, your courage in doing that and sharing that, but also to, I guess, challenge your family, and then for your family to have that healing moment that you've brought about, which is phenomenal. And how was it for you hearing that from your family after all these years?
Yeah, it was. So I think, so my family, so when I first came out when I was 17, there was a lot of very negative reaction, as I said. So mum, so both of my parents had very tragic stories that they sort of associated with homosexuality. So my dad's best friend, who ended up being gay, he unfortunately killed himself. My mother, had Warwick's story. She had an uncle who was gay who had a really tragic ending as well. So I think when I came out, they were like, oh no, our son is going to, have this really tragic or potentially violent or bad health, And so it came from love, but as a 17-year-old, sitting them down trying to say this, it was really hard to hear their reactions. But through the years, they came to terms with it, and we all have got to a really good place now. But we hadn't probably addressed what actually happened back when I was 17 as much. So, yeah, I'm glad that we did address that, that they did have an opportunity to apologise, that I got an opportunity to explain to them why that was hurtful, and, how much impact. And I think that's why I'm glad it's in the book, is that it sort of teaches us that even just how impactful your words can be, and just at those really important moments, your reactions and words in your inner circle of family. So I hope that that's something that people get out of the book as well.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. So a cold case in 1944, how do you even begin to start to investigate that?
So that started back with Mum and I. So we figured it was also around the launch of Trove. So I'm sure lots of nods again. So Trove is the most amazing resource. I hear horror stories of life before Trove, of going through all the physical papers. So thankfully I avoided that. But yeah, Mum and I, figured that if someone was murdered on the home front during World War II, that it potentially was news, and sure enough it was. And basically, because it was such a mystery, the detectives published a lot of details about Warwick's final night alive, just to try and unearth any sort of witnesses and try and piece together what had happened. So yeah, straight away I got a really broad overview of his final night alive and the investigation through Trove, and that's sort of where it stayed for a long time. And then, as I mentioned, once I picked it up again after uni, I realised that maybe I should dive into the archives, and I found I got the murder files. So that's what it's called when the detectives' notes. So there was a 8-month nationwide hunt basically for the killer, and so 150 pages of very illegible cursive writing and acronyms. So I had to piece that together. Had the full murder board, with all the maps and the suspects.
So
and
what room of the house was that in?
I have to admit that it was a digital murder board. Got all the official documents, so the coroner's inquiry, they're amazing, all the testimonies from the eyewitnesses. Warwick was a soldier, as I said, so anyone who's was a soldier has an amazing archival, material evidence that's documented that I could access. They were sort of the crux of what the investigation was.
Yeah, and so you mentioned being at university helped with the research. Did you have people help you along the way to say, maybe try this archive or maybe contact these people? How did that happen?
Short answer, no. I sort of was feeling my way through. I often think back now, like if I was to do this again, I'm not sure if it would be a 10-year project. A lot of it was like teaching myself what to do. I did, when I started getting towards the end, that's when I started to engage more with experts, and they were really helpful because they could tell me the name of the document that I really need to look at, or what that terminology meant, or I sort of was building together a theory, and I wanted to run that past some experts to see if that was plausible, and thankfully it was. I also looked at a lot of other crimes that happened on the home front, so I didn't realise that there was quite a few murders during World War II in Australia, so I looked into those as well, and sort of to kind of understand the different scenarios and the social context, and I spoke to a criminologist who was able to say, that's a pretty viable way of approaching this as well. So, definitely towards the end I had a bit of help, which was great.
And one thing, there's many things you do well, but in particular is capturing the what it felt like to be in Townsville in 1944, and then you also follow Warwick's military journey to Papua New Guinea. So you yourself, you mentioned in the book you went to Townsville? Yeah. So how was that sort of retracing? What was that like? Yeah,
so I actually studied photography at university. So I'm quite a visual person, and when I was writing it, I really wanted it to be really evocative. I had this idea, like I was put to sleep in grade 10 with a grade 10 curriculum learning about World War II, but what I was discovering was fascinating. And I really wanted to make it fascinating for other people as well. And a big part of that was, bringing it to life and what it looked like, what it smelt like. And at the other part of that was to centre sort of what people's first-hand experience would have been like. So on one hand, there was a lot of archival research for that. So there's an amazing resource out there by University of New South Wales called Australians at War. And you can listen to... I listen to like hours and hours, but like one person will have 8 hours interview of the most amazing questions, and the type that I'm fascinated with, like what did you have for breakfast, and what was it like to go to a dance, and what was your relationship with your fellow army soldiers, and the other archive was the Australian War Memorial, has amazing videos and photos and paintings, so that was another part of bringing it to life. But as you said, I also did site visits. So I went up to Townsville because I really wanted to see the murder site and how it all went, and he spent his final night alive walking around, going to lots of different hotels and pubs, and so I wanted to go experience that, and I ended up having quite a not a great experience up there. I, believe it or not, a member of the army, so an actual signalman, came up to me and basically, targeted me because I was gay, and I clearly wasn't from around town, and he actually hit me across the face. So yeah, it was absolutely awful. And I think a running theme I discovered with this book is I was like, well, 70 plus years ago, ancient history, how can it possibly be relevant? But it just kept coming up time and time again that it's not ancient history at all. And my visit in Townsville was testament to that as well.
Yeah, oh, that's terrible. Yeah. With your research into the archives, there's the New Guinea girls. I got it right. I've been asking Jonathan, what were they called? And I just found that fascinating that you capture this day-to-day life of the army in New Guinea during the war, and there were these open, extremely, I shouldn't say extremely, but quite effeminate men, and they sort of were just allowed to exist, right, as part of this ecosystem. And then it wasn't until reading your book that I even knew that these men were there and that they were able to be as open as they were during the war. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, that was one of the most rewarding things to discover doing my research. So, as I mentioned, one of the big questions was, were there gay people during World War II? And through that question, I found Yorick Small's work, who is an academic who has researched this a lot. I read his book, and that's how I came to discover the New Guinea girls. I think another broad insight that I got that was absolutely fascinating was I think I had the assumption that, liberation is a very linear process, that people were homophobic and then now we're not. And it just wasn't the case at all. And what I actually discovered was sort of homophobia as we know it today actually started after World War II. That, it wasn't all amazing for people back in the 40s, but there actually was a bit more space. People either sort of were ignorant to it, just thought, oh, well, as long as you don't bother anyone else, turned a blind eye. There was a few different reactions, and not all of them were outright homophobia. And yeah, as you mentioned, the New Guinea girls was one of the most rewarding things to discover. The way they were discovered wasn't by wonderful means. So the US forces, on the other hand, were very diligent with policing queer people during World War II, less so the Australians. And part of this investigation is they uncovered the existence of these effeminate men who were having sex with their soldiers. And they told the Australian forces, and were like, we need to get rid of them. Yeah. Side note, it was quite a complicated time because at the time, homosexuality was thought of as a criminal act, but they just heard rumours and knew it existed, so you can't, persecute them based on a rumour. So they're like, what do we do with these guys? And what they decided was that, okay, we'll let them come forward, and if they admit to it, then we can just discharge them and get rid of them that way. Sure enough, 17 guys came forward, and now there's the most amazing archival evidence of these men and what their life was like back in Australia before the war and during the war. They had, it sounded like a fascinating time. They, used to have jungle parties. They used to steal, fruit and make grog, and they used to have wild, relationships with all sorts of people. And they had sing-alongs. They used to help each other, with how to navigate the politics. They called each other Bubbles and Dear and Love. And so when I was learning about these New Guinea girls, I was like, well, I didn't learn that in Year 10. All I learned about was these, hyper-masculine, heterosexual, vision. So learning about that, I was like, okay, that's a different national, war story. And yeah, it was really fascinating to learn about those people.
So with the 17, did they come forward to get out of the war?
Well, that's the other trick that, yeah, exactly. So you got to, I guess with all archival, evidence, you always got to be critical around, were people just, sweet, I get to be discharged. Yeah. But, I think that it wasn't just their testimonies; they were identified and they were known. In fact, there was other evidence of the reputation of Australians that went well beyond this investigation. So I think their stories do, hold up.
And you mentioned post-war that homophobia got worse. Why was that?
I think it's sort of, it's linked in with what happened post-war. Like, I think everything got quite conservative. It became about the family, about rebuilding the nations after the awful experience. And I think with that, it really started to clamp down. I think maybe awareness started to increase as well of what was really happening. And so, I think the policing got much more diligent. I did a bit of research into what happened in the military post World War II as well, and it basically escalated in the decades after World War II, and it sort of peaked in the 80s, probably because of HIV/AIDS, and that's when awful stories of witch hunts and interrogations, and really it was really, really awful the way that queer service people were treated. It got worse and worse and worse, and in recent decades it has definitely got better, but it's pretty shocking, and not that long ago the way queer people were treated.
Another aspect of the book is during World War II in Australia, and you have the American forces who are in Australia, and you capture just how complex the legal system was then with this, I was going to say occupying force, not occupying, but a force that was almost their own country within Australia. Can you tell us a little bit about how that all segmented?
I think it's, a lot of people know around the sort of the impact that the US forces had on Australia. There was just a huge amount of them, and there was a lot of tensions between the Australians and the American forces, and I think most commonly it's cited that tensions because of women. So there was this perception that the Australian soldiers owned Australian women, but unfortunately the US uniforms were very handsome and they were paid quite a lot and they could afford all the nice goodies. So the Australian women were very fond of these American soldiers, and that caused quite a lot of tension. But there was another side of all these Americans in Australia, was that all these queer people who were in little communities in the US, quite conservative Christian, they were all pulled together and sent to the other side of the world. They had no idea where they were, and really gave them an opportunity to find each other and to create communities and to sort of explore their sexuality as well. So it was incredibly, there was lots of positives and negative outcomes of that. So as I mentioned earlier, I did look into other crimes that happened, and there were some crimes committed by the US forces here. And part of that was probably for the same motivations of, well, I'm on the other side of the world. That legal aspect that you're referring to was that the US soldiers, even though they're in Australia, they just had to abide by US laws. So that was quite complicated. There was a lot of examples of the US forces just kind of would rather just transfer them instead of dealing with the crimes that they committed. It was an incredibly complicated and disruptive time with lots of different things changing. And I think one interesting thing that I learned through researching this book is that the Americans actually brought a lot of queer culture and what we sort of think of queer culture today as well, because the Australians are a little bit behind the Americans when it came to that side of things. So, language and other sort of things has actually stuck around. So, it's another interesting side of the US invasion of Australia.
Absolutely. And when you are researching, you're doing your detective work in the book, and I think you describe it really well, and it is quite complex how the local Townsville police, and then I guess all the hurdles or barriers they have, because you've got servicemen who are, particularly if they're in the Navy, they're moving from port to port and the different jurisdictions. Was that something that you were aware of before you started this?
Definitely not, no. So one of the big theories was that it was committed by a US sailor. So they actually, this is the reason why there was that nationwide manhunt. Basically, they got all the records of every ship that was in Townsville at the time and interrogated every crew. The US forces weren't particularly cooperative. There was one example of the US forces who didn't allow the detectives to do their job. They didn't want them to meddle with their piece of their military base. There was another example of a captain outright lying to a Australian detective, saying that, don't worry about this guy, we just paid him off, but actually he had deserted. And one of the theories was that it could have been a deserter who was not just running away from the war, they were running away from the crime. So, incredibly complicated to navigate that, because they would have been well aware that Australian detectives didn't have a lot of power over them, and that wasn't their primary objective of being in Australia. They were much more concerned with World War II. So, that definitely hampered the investigation.
And were there... and you certainly talk about it in the book, coming across other crimes that happened at the time that did you think were related to Warwick's?
Yeah, so there was another crime that the detectives discovered. So up in Cairns, there was a gentleman who was coward punched by 3 US sailors, and he died because he hit his head. It was an awful crime, and one of the theories was that it could have been connected, and that these sailors were going up and down, the Queensland coast and committing these crimes, and was one of the theories that they investigated. But as I said earlier, there was a shocking amount of crime. I actually had a long list, and I actually wrote about all the I nearly was thinking of calling it the Homefront murders. I know that's a TV show, so I didn't call it that. But there was actually a shocking amount of Homefront murders, and not all of them made it into the book, only the main ones that were considered to be related to Warwick's case.
Is not wanting to take Grace's question, is this are you interested in looking at other cold cases in the future, or is this your detective research done?
I think, it's a tricky one. I am drawn to true crime, but I think one thing, thinking about true crime, and because I looked at other gay hate crimes that have happened in the decades that happened after Warwick, and I think that it can be quite, and I'm more drawn to finding positive stories, I suppose. There was a review of the book in The Conversation, and they picked up on basically the book is a testament to the belief of the inherently tragic aspect of being gay and the awful outcomes that can happen and these crimes and murders. And I'm certainly interested and drawn to it, but I think I'm still fascinated with the era. I love the 1930s and 40s. I'm still fascinated with queer history, but I'm more interested in happier stories that I want to look into.
Yeah, but I think The Boy in the Dress, though, is also, I think it's brave, and to hear it from a gay man looking at these historical gay crimes and sharing your truth and shining a light on it and just going, this is not okay. We need that as well. I think it's, yes, we can have lots of gay happy stories, but this is our history, and we need to shine a light on it. I think you do that fantastically. So we have a writing question.
Okay, great.
which is any advice or top tips for writers out there?
Okay.
Now that you are a writer.
I think, if probably when I first got the book deal and I actually met the publisher, one of the girls that I met just over lunch was like, it's a family history story and it's actually interesting. And she was kind of shocked by that. But I think the insight there is that it's, we all have an amazing story and mysteries that happen in our family. But I think if your objective is to get published, it's always good to run it through the is it interesting to someone else test. There's amazing, stories out there. I've even, talking about the book, I went up to Townsville and ran a workshop about researching and telling a family historical story. And I was absolutely blown away by the most fascinating stories out there that people are looking into and also spending decades of their life looking into. So absolutely they're out there, but I think it's important to, if you do want to write your family story, to maybe test it with a few people to see if there's got sort of a global interest or has a point that you want to make as well. I think it's hard as well because I think another thing that I inherited from my mum was, a real drive and determination to get to the bottom of it, as she was definitely a sort of person that could just spend days and days and days on Ancestry.com, for example. She went all the way back to her French royalty ancestors, which was very proud to tell people. And I also inherited that sort of, approach to work. So I think, it can be really hard to finish a project like this without that, is what I'm saying, basically, that, I get up at 6 o'clock every morning and write for a few hours, every weekend writing. I spent weekends and weekends at the library, so it's just a huge commitment and a lot of time. I guess, just being aware of that while you're embarking these projects and loving the project that you're working on and it meaning enough to you to really commit to that is really important, because that's the only reason why this book is in reality today.
Now, no spoilers. Do you feel like now, allegedly, know what happened to Warwick and who possibly did it?
I do put forward a theory in the book. The detectives did come close to... They got a description of who they think did it. There were a few eyewitnesses. But as it was committed in the 40s, so no technology, no CTV, no internet. So basically they just had a verbal description of a person. The person who they thought it was, the Navy... little insight, the Navy wouldn't allow the detectives to take that man to Queensland to be able to be seen by the eyewitness and identified. They basically just asked him, like, were you there and did you do it? He surprisingly said no. But, there is a lot of evidence that suggest it was him, but there was enough evidence, so that didn't happen. But so I think that's what was really fascinating about getting the murder files, that I could actually find out who they spoke to, what they said, all the evidence, all the eyewitness statements that wasn't sort of covered in the newspapers. I put forward a theory of what I think happened, but it's a very complicated case, long time ago, and a lot of gaps in it.
Do you feel now sort of, I don't know if at peace is the right word, but you feel like for Warwick, by you doing this, that there's some justice, or how do you feel about that? Yeah,
it's tricky. Justice, probably not. I guess I came to the conclusion, I think when I started, I was desperate to get a name of the killer, and I was desperate to find out exactly what happened. But after I've researched all this, I think that, and I do cover this in the book, that he was really just a victim of the war and what the war had done to Australia, and the and I think when we think of war, we think of battlefronts and we think of, all that combat. But actually the impacts were way beyond that. And, there was a brownout, so it was really dark and, no one really saw what happened. He was from Sydney, he was in Townsville because of the war. I think there's just so many things that happen because of war and how awful war is. So I kind of blame that more than any sort of one person. It's tricky. I definitely feel like I'm happy with where I've got to with this case. I'd like to think that Warwick would be happy that his ancestor 70 years later has picked up his story and valued it. He was only 20 when he died, so it was a shockingly short life. I actually, just went up to Townsville again for the second time for the Townsville Writers' Festival up there, and I was able to visit his grave for the first time. And that was a really emotional time. It's a gorgeous graveyard, impeccably well maintained. There was someone there like pressing the grass while we were there just to make sure it's all perfect and covered in flowers, and up in balmy Townsville where it's nice and warm and all the flowers smelt beautiful. And I like to think that he'd be happy with what I've done.
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful tribute to Warwick, what you've done. Mm-hmm. We have a shout-out question that we ask all our guests, and that is, firstly, how can everyone connect with you on socials, or if you have got any events coming up?
So next week I am participating with Melbourne Writers' Festival. So I have a talk on Thursday, 1:00 at the State Archives. It's actually in partnership with the Victorian Archive Centre, PROV, and I'm going to be interviewed by Dr. Eve Rees, who is a trans historian, so very excited about that. On all social media, I've actually really got into TikTok at the moment. I'm 31 and I was like, I'm beyond it. But I looked into it and I've actually found my people. They love queer history. So I've been doing all these little minute videos about all these other queer stories that I found, and people are loving it. Yeah, I haven't had that sort of response from Instagram or Twitter. So find me on TikTok. I'm Jonathan Butler, author.
Fantastic. And so you have the opportunity to shout out any LGBTIQA plus artists, books, shows, organisations.
Yeah, I think AQUA, which is the Australian Queer Archives, they are an amazing organisation. They were really helpful. A lot of people associated with them were incredibly great. So Graham Willett, who's involved with AQUA, was instrumental in writing this book and helped me with my research. I was able to go there and actually read all the testimonies of the New Guinea girls. So not only did I read about them in a secondary source, I got to go see that primary source and read through that at the archives, which was actually really amazing. And I actually volunteered there as well a little bit, which was fun because it was a very rewarding experience, because what AQUA do is that they actively acquire queer material, and so things like posters for club parties and T-shirts from protests, and things that I didn't actually think were important enough to be archived, but they absolutely believe they are. So it's a very affirming place to be. One sort of tangible thing I can shout out is they've recently done a report called 100 Queer Places and Objects. So it's like an amazing historical document. It's a really beautiful report, and you can learn about all these places and objects that have a really interesting queer Victorian story associated with them, which I've no surprises really loved reading, and going to the places and finding the objects. So check that out.
It sounds like a good thing for your TikTok.
Funny you say that. There's a few that have been inspired by that report.
Brilliant. And what is your hope for the LGBTIQA plus communities?
It's a big question. I think it's interesting with equal marriage and the impact that equal marriage has had. So from a personal point of view, so my mother passed away while I was writing this book, so just a few weeks after the equal marriage announcement. So she never found out that it was a published book. She actually said to me, you know, like, you must tell Warwick's story, when she was quite ill. And obviously I took those words quite seriously, and I used to read chapters of the book to her in her nursing home. She had MSA, multiple systems atrophy. It's a really awful disease. But sorry, I'm on a bit of a tangent there, but equal marriage, she was very happy, so it was a really important moment for me, for my family. It was wonderful and really joyous. I think one thing that we're all sort of realising now, though, is that that wasn't the end of queer rights. You know, it didn't actually do much for trans people. We still hear about youth suicide, especially, you know, in regional centres. So I think you might assume that homophobia is over and that it's all good now because of something like that, but we have a long way to go still. So I think, it's important to understand, you know, where we are today, truly, and what's still to go, even though we can be happy that we have had some wins.
Great. Thank you very much. And we have some time for questions. I believe Grace has a question for us. Grace is our book reviewer on QWS podcast.
Quality reads. I just wanted to ask if you have anything going on in the future, a new book perhaps?
Yeah, so I alluded to it before. This was acquired in 2020, and there was long gaps between each round of edits. So I had a lot of lockdown, being trapped in my house. And so what I did, of course, was I acquired a series of letters from a gay photographer in the 1940s, hundreds and hundreds of letters, and I read them all. And he had the most fascinating life. He had, just who he met, and it's sort of linked what I was saying before, is that we assume that, you know, being gay in the 1940s must have been pretty awful, but, you know, he was actually part of a queer world that basically ran the New York creatives world. So he's had a really fascinating life, and I'd love to write about him and but this time I'm experimenting with historical fiction. So as I mentioned, this is non-fiction. It's very much narrative. I did want to tell a story. I did want to bring it to life. I want to be evocative. But at the end of the day, it's non-fiction, and I had to, you know, make sure that everything was as close to the historical record as I could possibly get it. So it's been quite liberating to, explore internal thoughts and feelings and truths, and I have a real connection with his voice and the way he spoke to his friends and his diaries and that sort of thing. So it's been a really rewarding creative experience to go through that.
That's amazing. So are you using extracts from the letters as well as the historical fiction, or are you fictionalising the whole thing?
So the main thing I've taken from letters is just how his voice, so it's first person, the book that I'm writing, so I really wanted to get a sense of how he spoke, and his relationships and what actually happened. But no, it's fictionalized, so it's all, I've given myself a bit more creative freedom. But all the characters are real, and what happens is real, but everything else is my imagination.
Awesome. Can't wait for that. And can I put an order in for the New Guinea Girls book?
You want to know more about them?
I'd love to. I think
they're amazing. I really love them too.
Great. Any other questions? No? Well, thank you very much, Jonathan Butler. That's been fantastic. And if you haven't read it, The Boy in the Dress, I highly recommend it. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, Rob.
And thank you, Joe.